So today we'll talk about avoiding burnout, which I think is a really key topic for us because so many of us are working online and maybe not taking time for breaks and so forth. On Thursday this week, we'll focus on games and apps in teaching, and I think that goes along a little bit with last week's discussion of social media and its value in teaching. So as usual, there's an article that I send out with these just in case you want a little extra input or ideas about what we're talking about. And maybe I will start with the article. And actually I had this up. This is kind of a common phrase sometimes you see in the world of teaching. A lot of times you see it in K-12. And I think when this gets shared with the world, I think it has a positive spin. And I'm not suggesting that teachers aren't dedicated, but the more and more I've seen this phrase, it made me think a little bit about the challenges of teaching and how often we don't talk about burnout. And so the quote is, teachers are like candles, they consume themselves to light the way for others. And certainly, self-sacrifice and spending a lot of time to teach an excellent class and delivering the best lessons possible and tutorials is something we should all do in teaching. I'm not knocking that. The challenge with this, though, is the word consume. Because, if a candle burns itself out, it's gone, right? And so I actually use this to spin the metaphor in a different way and say, yes, it's important that we light the way for others in terms of teaching and offering opportunities for our students. But if we do too much, if we don't take breaks, if we allow ourselves to get completely wrapped up in any job that we work in, regardless of what it is, if we put too many hours in, we will consume ourselves. And so I'm kind of spinning this in a different way, suggesting that we should really use this as an example of not just the importance of helping our students, but helping ourselves. Self-help and focusing on your own needs, I think, is super important. And it's something I think, and I've taught K-12 just for 1 year. I taught music in K-12 ages ago, and most of my experience is university and community college. But the thing I think that's interesting about both K-12 and teaching college is the idea that teachers, it might be a little taboo if teachers talk about how they're stressed or if teachers talk about challenges they're having. And it depends on the colleagues you talk to. I just know years ago when there was kind of a group of younger faculty and older faculty that had been at the college for a while, some of the younger faculty that were new, or not necessarily young, but let's say new to the college, if we would bring up some of these issues, sometimes it seemed controversial. And so I think that's changed over time. I think people are more open to the idea that indeed you could talk about being stressed or challenges with students. I'm reminded of when I worked in the service industry for Six Flags in the theme park industry, that it was the same thing. We were stressed, but we were stressed by guests or tourists who visited. Working in the service industry, you do a lot of what sociologist Arlie Hochschild calls emotional labor, where you often put your own emotional needs in check or on hold, such that you're meeting the needs of the guests that you're serving. And so the service industry is another parallel here, because sometimes, an employer will say, well, you got to meet the needs of the guest. And that's certainly the case in the theme park industry, starting with Disney. But then what about meeting your own needs? And what about situations where you're dealing with stress? And it can happen in a classroom setting where you have inappropriate students. It certainly happens in the service and tourism industry, even, before COVID, of course, where someone would get aggressive with you or someone would get upset, even though you're doing everything within your power to help that person out. So this side of things where you put your own emotions and feelings and sort of subdue your stress and repress it can be really detrimental. And this super long article, and let me just put it in the chat room, and for those of you watching the video afterwards that we're making here, I will go ahead and link this under the YouTube video, so just check it out. It's actually one of the best ones. It completely, I think, connects with some of these perspectives I'm talking about. And this was written recently, and it has September 14th, so it has a real connection to COVID. And I think you might say COVID presents a perfect storm for us in that there's already stresses involved in teaching. And with COVID, the stresses increase because we're isolated. We're indoors more. Our students are indoors and isolated. We're talking about things like whether or not to require students to have their cameras on during a Zoom session. All those sorts of scenarios make for a real challenging situation for teachers and also, of course, for students. And we're focusing on teachers, instructors today, but of course, classified staff, administrators, board members, directors all have stresses as well. Different ones, but equally important. So this discussion of what burnout is, I think, is really important. And they talk about this idea of, drowning in Zoom meetings, grading, advising 24/7. There's almost a sense with Zoom where you, I think we have Elizabeth joining here, just to make sure. Yep. Hey, welcome, Elizabeth. Good to have you. So we're just going through, and let me post it again here in the chat room. So we're kind of just starting off going through this article, which I think is a good one. It's called Burning Out. And again, I mentioned that we're specifically today talking about teachers or professors, but very clearly this relates to anyone teaching in higher education, working in higher ed, directing an office, working with faculty, whatever it is that you do, administration, classified director positions. So this situation where we're constantly being asked to log on to Zoom meetings, and I sometimes think, the attendance in these Zoom sessions probably was better pre-COVID because less people were actually on Zoom, and we had really good attendance in person as well. And I think the challenge of Zoom is that a lot of us are feeling burnout related to being on these online meetings so often. Now, this is directly from the World Health Organization. This is defining burnout, which I think is interesting that this actually has like a disease classification. It's defined as a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. So I think it's a very easy definition, but complex in terms of how to deal with it. So obviously stress is something that we all probably have to come to terms with. So the key here is you have to manage your stress. Some of the symptoms of chronic burnout could be a feeling of energy depletion, feeling exhausted, increased mental distance from or cynicism and negativity towards one's job, and reduced professional efficacy. So you think about any of these are challenging, and certainly you could have multiple forms of these at once. And we'll talk about, after we go through the article, maybe some of our own solutions to dealing with burnout. But as I said, I think this is a really complete article in that it takes you through what burnout is, some of the causes, and even talks about it not as a purely individual problem. Higher education, again, I think has a lot of situations where burnout happens and maybe people are not allowed to talk about it. I know in graduate school, a lot of in both of my graduate programs, a lot of students were stressed out, but it wasn't necessarily something you talked about in class. Maybe if you went out having a drink with friends or going out and doing something, your colleagues in your grad program, you would talk about some of these situations. But as I mentioned earlier, I think in the higher ed profession in general, we don't really promote people talking about this. In the social sciences, we encourage people to be reflexive and critical of their positions, of their situations, of their organizations. But I think the perception would be, going back to my phrase, and again, this could apply to non-teachers as well, this idea you're consuming yourself to light the way for others. Again, it's not bad to help others out and to light the way. But if you worked, 18 hours a day and you slept for 3 hours and you delivered the most amazing classes or you ran the best possible office at the college, maybe that's great for others, but if you're consuming yourself, eventually, like the candle, you're going to burn yourself out. And that's why I think this metaphor that is used so often, and if you Google this phrase, it's all over the internet. And I found out about this because my wife, when she taught K-12, was given these little candles and they had the phrase on it. And we both laughed once saying, well, that's kind of a very cynical or fatalistic message to send. And again, the positive message is you should light the way for others. Great message. But if you totally consume yourself in the process, you will there'll be nothing left of you other than some ashes. You're a burnt out candle. So I think what's interesting about this is they're saying here it's not an individual problem, right? So you could think about how institutions, and not just our institution, any institution of work, not just within higher education, deals with this, and what sort of foundations are present and how we can help each other out. And this is kind of interesting. You could read some of the articles they mentioned, but it says that the article includes a series of cultural and structural recommendations for institutions to reduce burnout, such as not setting toxic expectations, encouraging and modeling work-life balance, valuing quality over quantity of work, and understanding the current limited research funding environment. We don't deal with that, although we do actually get grant funding. And then this point about the perfect storm, I mentioned this earlier, but again, I think there's a lot happening right now with being remote, having to work on Zoom so much as we are, being isolated. And then this is not the case for everyone, and I don't assume everyone shares my politics, but I know for me personally, just looking at the world and seeing how dark it is, not just the United States, but you look at Brazil, you look at Europe, the growth of authoritarian movements again, and authoritarian leaders, and the attack on the civil rights of all sorts of populations worldwide. I think it is kind of a perfect storm for stress and for feeling really, really overwhelmed. Solange was mentioning, I think last time, but it's like, wow, we have 1 week until the election, a week from today. Who knows what will be decided next week, but it'd be a lot of stress for a lot of people, staying up late at night, seeing if any of the elections are called and so forth. So that perfect storm is something I think we have to be very aware of, and just make sure that we manage all of our stress and take advantage of all the resources we have. Kind of interesting, mental health is everyone's responsibility, and I think that's true. I think as colleagues, I know with some of the faculty I work with closely in my meta major, if someone is stressed out, I'll say, hey, would you like to have a Zoom? We could all get together and just talk about stuff. If you kind of feel with an email or a text that someone is really experiencing a lot of stress, and you feel comfortable reaching out to that person, some people don't want unsolicited advice. It's kind of a personal thing. But you could reach out to that person and say, hey, do you want to talk sometime? How are you feeling? What's going on? And you might actually discover in that conversation that you're sharing in some similar challenges. For example, maybe you're feeling challenged about having to do so many Zoom sessions. When I was serving on this accreditation team a week or two ago, I was mentioning to people that I had day one was 12 Zoom meetings, day 2 was 8 or 9, and then I had a board meeting that night. It was crazy. I was just exhausted, and I felt like I can't do this. I can't be on so many meetings in a day and keep my concentration. And by the time I was doing the board meeting presentation, my eyes were kind of watering, and I had eye strain, and I felt like I barely could stay awake for the whole thing. So we all know our personal limits. With our friends and colleagues, we don't. If you're close enough to them, you could reach out and say, hey, let's talk sometime. I know you hate Zooming, but let's have a Zoom conversation sometime, just to check in with each other to make sure that we're helping each other out. And then it's kind of a sad point to end on, but they talk about it's kind of an impossible moment. And this is also talking about institutions of learning where there's more research. Faculty where we teach don't have research responsibilities. We do have professional development responsibilities, serving on committees, and doing that kind of professional work. So that kind of perfect storm of a big workload, I think, goes along with some of these challenges we're talking about, and they talk about the risks of inaction and why we need to make sure that we do everything for ourselves. It says here, you want to enroll more students and graduate more students and start exciting academic programs. We don't really do cutting edge research. Some of us do. Your ability to do all of these things, in my opinion, is much more probable if you've got conditions in place so that people can thrive. So a real challenge for a small school is sometimes we say we have a limited bandwidth. And that, I think, is something for us to be very aware of. And again, I'm not just saying LTCC, I'm saying every institution of learning. Anywhere I've ever taught, there have been challenges, different challenges, but always challenges that should be addressed. In the case of where we are now with COVID, and again, I would say the political climate, some of the stuff that's, even universities nowadays having to withdraw their diversity training programs because of one of the president's executive orders is causing a lot of reactions and very quick movement trying to decide how to protect yourselves from legal or funding challenges if the federal government decided to pull funding, if a university or college was doing multicultural training. So burnout here, I think, perfect storm for just thinking about how to address the situation, how to take time for ourselves, and so forth. And I have a list here, and we can add to the list. But yeah, I mean, just the pure time requirements of having to do multiple Zoom sessions a day. Everyone's schedule is different. Obviously, if you're teaching a class, if you're having meetings with colleagues, if you have committee meetings, other all sorts of different meetings and reasons we meet on Zoom, but they start to add up, and over time, it has an effect on you. And again, it can be a physical effect, and it can also be a psychological effect. The physical thing of sitting too long, not taking breaks. I have a standing desk here, so what I try to do is I will lift the desk and stand up, particularly on those days where if I have 12 Zoom meetings, I'm going to try to break up my day with sitting and standing, and hopefully get outside and exercise and, pet my cats or whatever. But at some point, I think you hit a limit, and it's happening with students, it's happening with faculty, with staff, administration on our campus, because we are being asked to do something that we didn't do in the past. There was a little bit of Zoom use, and COVID hit, and it went from, I would say, like 1%, and I'm thinking of people like a few of us who would jump on for an online meeting. It was pretty rare in those days. A couple of instructors, I know Larry Green did Zoom, synchronous Zoom sessions with his math classes, but most of us didn't do that. I did a few Zoom sessions prior to COVID for meetings with colleagues across the country because, it's more practical than having to maybe get on the phone and you could see someone. Once COVID hit, it seemed like everything, our operations moved entirely online and to Zoom. So it's a new challenge, and I think we're coming up here. March will be about a year, since this all happened. Approximately, it was kind of mid to late March where things started shutting down, and we went virtual. But yeah, you're right. It's just we're all dealing with it, and so in a sense, we're all in it together in terms of our students, our faculty, our staff, administration. So yeah, challenging to say the least. Okay, so at this point, I'll just jump in and quickly summarize some of the strategies we talked about in our workshop. Again, I thought these were really good ideas for continuing the conversation about avoiding burnout. So the first one of these is thinking about work-life balance. And if you read the literature, certainly on de-stressing, it's always talking about this. The challenge of work-life balance right now, as we're all aware of, is the fact that work and life are blurring. If we're all working, Zooming in our home offices, it's really hard maybe to take breaks. So you have to do something deliberate, like getting outside, playing with your pets, playing with your kids, doing something with your partner, and just making sure that you step away from your computer or even your office space that maybe is consuming too much of your time, such that you can't achieve effective work-life balance. Flexibility, I think, is always key. I mean, we're being flexible with our students in terms of some of their issues and helping them deal with COVID and work-life issues. And hopefully students are also flexible with us. In some cases, if we're not 100% on our game, hopefully they understand, and patience, I think, is also a key to add to the idea of flexibility. I mentioned this earlier, but taking breaks and disconnecting from your work life, from your situation in your office, Zooming, working on the computer is always key. So just come up with ways to take more breaks in your life. Having variety is also key, and variety could apply to our leisure time to make sure that we're taking time for ourselves and our loved ones. We're not spending too much time on work. We're not doing the same things, because there's a sense of sameness that dominates what we're doing. We're always on Zoom, or we're always in the computer. We're always grading ISP classwork and so forth. So to have variety in our lives and then also in our work, certainly if we're creating a class for our students, we might think of ways to provide more variety to them and also to us. If we're tired of grading multiple choice exams, then maybe offer less multiple choice exams, because the scale of what we're dealing with now seems more intense, even if it's the same workload, just because of the stresses of being at home and feeling so isolated, the political climate, and some of the other things we talked about earlier in the video. Perspective is also important. Certainly thinking about how we can have perspective in difficult times is key. Some people, of course, will rely on, and this relates to the next one, meditative outlets. In some cases, it could be actual meditation. In other cases, it might be a spiritual outlet. It could be leisure. It could be something you do for fun. Maybe you go fishing, or maybe you like mountain biking. Whatever that happens to be, find those meditative outlets, because those can offer you important perspective in these challenging and stressful times. Totally related to that, get some exercise, go outdoors, focus on your health. In the workshop today, I talked about having a stand-up desk, and so I purchased one because I thought it's really important to have this at home as well as at work. And since we're not at the office at One College Drive, it's important for us to have the right equipment that we need in our home offices as well. Relationships are also important. For many of us right now, a lot of stuff is happening on Zoom because of the pandemic. So taking time out for your relationships, even if that means time for Zooming, as much as we're Zoom fatigued, beyond belief perhaps, very important to do this because it's better to see your friends, family, and loved ones on Zoom, if that's the only safe way of doing it, than not seeing them at all. Mental health and taking time to really process trauma is also key. I think it's just really important to make sure that you take mental health time, that you disconnect, that you focus on maintaining a balance between work and your fun stuff that you do with your friends and family and your pets and so forth. So taking mental health time for yourself is important. Possibly saying no. It's always a tricky one, obviously, but if you can say no to taking on new tasks that don't directly relate to your job, or in your everyday life, if someone is asking you to help with something, whatever that is, maybe also you seriously consider saying no, just because it might be too much in terms of your personal bandwidth, not just with work, but also everyday life and chores and that kind of stuff. And then lastly, it's not on the list here, but we also talked about the importance of the institution and reaching out to our managers and making sure that everyone's aware that we have challenges and that we're all in it together, and that maybe we can all collectively work to help deal with some of those challenges. So this is a summary, not totally exhaustive, but it's some of the stuff that we talked about here today during our workshop focused on avoiding burnout. Okay, I guess we'll... It's about 1, so I guess we'll call it quits. So if you're interested, Thursday again, we'll meet again to talk about more technology kind of related stuff. And then next Tuesday, we'll do